I think that there is a kind of unrestrained nature to him.
Yeah.
Where other people would not apply their own preferences quite so baldly. Like he's willing to take a level of public backlash. A lot of people in his position wouldn't be, right? Willing to gamble on Tesla in a way others wouldn't, right? There's I've met him a couple times, and there is a all-inness to him that is distinctive. For whatever reason in this era, we're seeing that pay off more for more people. I think it is a personality type particularly that is somewhat rewarded on social media. Like if you are this kind of person, a Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and there are others like them who can sort of operate at that level, at that scale, without a lot of the sense of social restraint that pulls a lot of people back. Like, I just don't want all this incoming for good and for ill. Like, this is a pretty good era for you. I sometimes joke that this is really the era of the trickster god. That the kind of personality type mythically that is doing well right now, like at the very, very high levels, is a trickster god. And then on the other side, like true restraint, right? So we don't talk about them as much, but it's been a very good couple of years for Joe Biden, for Tim Cook, for Jeff Bezos. Frankly, I think Mark Zuckerberg is profiting off the Elon thing quite well. All of a sudden it's like, maybe not that bad.
I'm Erik Torenberg, and this is Upstream with Erik Torenberg. Ezra Klein has been one of the most important voices in policy and politics over the last 10, 15 years. He's a policy wonk, but he also deeply understands technology and business, having founded Vox Media and having lived in California the past few years. In this episode, we cover Silicon Valley's approach to politics, new political factions within Silicon Valley, his great book, Why We're So Polarized, and his growing intellectual movement focused on a politics of abundance, or as he also calls it, supply-side progressivism. Here's Ezra. Ezra, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So Ezra, you have an upcoming book with Derek Thompson about the abundance agenda and about supply-side progressivism. Why don't you unpack what you're trying to do in that book and maybe trace a little bit of the evolution, whether it's what changed in the world or what changed in your thinking that led to the book?
Well, let me start with the idea rather than the book. The book is upcoming is a generous way to put it, given where we are in the process right now. But yeah, upcoming. Supply-side progressivism is an idea I'd been circling around, I'd say actually for a couple of years, and in many ways since moving here. And I would describe it as a coming together of three threads of observation or of inquiry. So one is simply moving to California. And a state I'm from. I grew up in Irvine, California. I went to school at UC Santa Cruz and UCLA. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. when I was 21 or so, and then came back 14 years later to the Bay Area. And this is a state governed by Democrats, governed by liberals, that has a lot of pretty profound problems, that for all of its vaunted progressivism is not getting in a lot of important areas progressive outcomes. And I would particularly say it's true around the ability to live a decent lifestyle on a normal middle-class salary. And so one thing about being focused on the political problems here separately from the national stage is, when you're in Washington, like say in 2010 or 2011, and you're watching Republicans threaten then as now to breach a debt ceiling for no reason and cause a global financial crisis, you get really focused on the problems of the Republican Party. But here you have to be focused on the problems of progressive governance. So that got me thinking about, well, what is a problem in California? The problem in California continuously across a range of issues is insufficient supply of typically physical goods. We have a lot of intangible goods, a lot of knowledge economy goods and capital in California. But when you talk about enough housing, enough mass transit, enough University of California system schools, enough clean energy capacity, enough transmission lines, we have real problems. So why was supply such a problem in so many places, not just California, but you look at Washington State, you look at New York, where liberals govern. That's piece one. Piece two is we transitioned from an era in which the big problems in the economy were demand side. Aftermath of the financial crisis, you're dealing with very low, very persistently low demand. You have people like Larry Summers in a previous guise talking about secular stagnation and an enduring economy without enough demand. And so a lot of us were focused to cover the economy on the problems of demand for a long time. And I think it's worth not underplaying this. We more or less solved the problem of demand. And that was in part through government policy, in part through a very accommodating Fed, in part through Donald Trump and Republicans deciding they actually did not care about austerity. And as soon as he got into office, spending a shit ton of money and putting a bunch into tax cuts. So he moved from demand being the problem to supply being the problem. Inflation, obviously, which we're kind of still living through, although it's curbing a little bit, prices. And behind the sharp rise in post-pandemic prices, you have what my wife Annie Lowry called in a sort of viral article a couple of years ago, the affordability crisis, the high cost of housing, of healthcare, of childcare, of education, et cetera. So this sort of moved to what I've called in some places a politics of prices. And then the final thing I'll say is that I'd been thinking for a long time, and particularly after my first book, Why We're Polarized, about what does a politics of technology look like? And that thinking got even sharper during the pandemic when you watched political solutions to problems run out of steam fairly quickly. We cannot maintain distancing, say, for very long, or lockdowns. But technological solutions like vaccines really prove worth their weight in gold. And in particular there with Warp Speed to me is a really remarkable and inspiring program where you actually did have the government step in, say, we really want to see a supply of this invention emerge very, very quickly. We're going to make it easier to do so. We're going to provide certainty in getting there. But once we do that, we are going to ensure the distribution is equitable. And the vaccine really is remarkable in terms of, I think, how equitable that distribution was, at least early on. And add that into climate crisis, where I think most people understand that the solutions we need rely very heavily on innovation. That gets you thinking about what other innovations we need to solve the problems we have. I'm a big animal rights and animal suffering person. I don't think we're going to make any progress on that unless we invent really remarkable alternative proteins that are tastier and healthier and cheaper and so on. And so that got me thinking a lot about politics of technology. And sort of those are the three main tributaries for me into what becomes supply-side progressivism, which is how do you focus on the supply of things we need to realize the kind of world and economy and society that progressives like me at least claim to want.
Yeah. Those are three areas to dig into. In some ways, your explanation rhymes with, or has some rhymes with Marc Andreessen's It's Time to Build. And in other ways, Tyler Cowen's kind of state capacity libertarianism. And yet you guys also, come at it from different perspectives. I'm curious whether on a processes perspective or whether on a outcomes perspective, where you differ from those two people or ideas or camps.
So I'd say a couple things. So one, I would say one place I differ from Marc, and I wrote this in response I did at Vox to It's Time to Build, is that I think Marc is quite distant from questions of institutions. He really framed that as almost just a kind of bizarre cultural problem. Build whatever you want. It doesn't matter what I'm building. I don't want to hear about what you think about what I'm building. Like whatever you build, I'll support that too. The question of why we have difficulty building requires, among other things, a really deep engagement with what has gone wrong when we have built before. Why did people erect institutions? Why did they create processes? Why did they create blockages? Why did they create systems and bills and so on that have made it so much easier to stop things from moving forward? And by the way, it's true for a lot of VCs who are very big kind of builder types on Twitter. But in my experience, a lot of them do not live in particularly dense places. And again, worth doing a little bit of self-reflection on that and what that implies about the pervasiveness of sentiments, which are very natural, that people want their communities to be like the community they bought into when they bought into there. When I make this point, I'm not just, it's not really a cheap effort at saying hypocrite. I think most people are hypocrites across a lot of different dimensions. It's to say that it should inspire the generosity we bring to our own inconsistencies should also be brought to those of others. So that's maybe one place where I would differ there. I have a much more sort of institutional and sort of rational actor view of why people come to the politics they do. Tyler is a little bit different. Tyler and state capacity libertarianism, I would just say the real difference between the two of us, Well, state capacity is a related but different concept to supply side-ism. State capacity is about the capacity the state has to act. Oftentimes, for supply side progressivism to work the way I want it to, you actually want to reduce the state's capacity to act. So, one thing Tyler's pointing out there is that libertarians often don't think very hard about places where the state needs to be capable of achieving its goals, say in pandemic prevention or pandemic response. I think the arguments I'm making around supply side liberalism, they're a little bit more agnostic. There are places where you would need the government to be able to do significantly more, places where you needed to start doing significantly less, which is a complicated thing about it. But I think the main difference for Tyler and I is in the final word of the two ideas. Tyler is I don't know if I truly believe Tyler's a libertarian anymore, but he is some kind of subvariant of a classical liberal in his own idiosyncratic, kind of wonderful way. And I am a progressive. And so my views about what things we need to create supply of are very connected to my views of how society should look and be ordered and what kind of equity we should be shooting for and what kind of justice we should be shooting for. Somebody who's done work very related to me is Virginia Postrel in her book, The Future and Its Enemies. And we were both on a panel together. And somebody in the audience raised this question of, well, look, like this all sounds well and good, but I've worked with these poor communities and, who get, these smelting factories or whatever it might be, that have toxic runoff put right next to them. And like, what do you have to say to that? And Virginia says, and it's a Breakthrough Institute panel, you can look it up on YouTube, but it's interesting. It's worth watching, I think. And she says, look, it sucks to be poor. It always has. And almost a definition of being poor is you live in an area where there is less voice and things people don't want to have are put there. And my view is that is not good enough. Like that is not an answer to this. That is not the way I want society to be ordered. That is not the way I want voice to work. And so the progressivism side of this is not just like tacked on there for branding reasons. The values I bring to politics, the kind of nudges I'm trying to deploy on society are important to me. And so they order what comes before it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The going back to your point on why we can't build, I want to look at a few examples, whether it's maybe education and housing. Is it much more complex than kind of entrenched interests, vetoing building because it wouldn't be in their interest, and the solution is to have kind of remove some of that veto power, or shed some light on the nuance here.
One tricky thing about this for me as I've gone into this is that it's very different in different places. And entrenched interests in any domain mean really different things. The reason it's been hard to get congestion pricing in New York City off the ground is different than the reason it is hard to get something done with multifamily housing in Atherton, which is different than why Diablo Canyon almost closed and may still someday close, a nuclear power plant in California. Which is different than why we haven't built a UC except for Merced since 19. There is a kind of specificity to this, which is tricky, is the only way I can put it. The Burning Man organization suing the Bureau of Land Management to stop a geothermal exploratory drill from happening outside Girl Lake, Nevada. Like all of these are different. Like what it means for the Burning Man institution to be an incumbent and what it means for homeowners to be incumbents and what it means for a community to not want a beloved forest near to be turned into solar panels. We have a lot of language like incumbents and status quo and entrenched interests and special interests. And I think that it's valuable language, but it often flattens a tremendous amount of nuance, including nuance within projects, right? Do we have actually good models of how to do community voice well and quickly? Are we? So I just did a podcast with Nick Bagley. I keep saying Bagley, who's a law professor at the University of Michigan, and he's a liberal. He was chief counsel to Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and he has this very, from a liberal perspective, I think incendiary article called I think it's called like the liberal procedure fetish or something like that. But the point is procedure fetish, and his point in that is that one problem in liberalism is that there's a tendency to try to legitimize state action through the imposition of a lot of procedure, a lot of procedure. And that's wrong. The way state action is made legitimate is by being prompt, fast, responsive, and fair. and that procedure actually doesn't get you there. It looks like it does. It sounds like it does. It feels to the people doing it like it does, but it's not actually having that outcome. And so it is failing and making the action legitimate. And that's something really worth considering. I mean, in many cases, what you have, I think, is not really that a bunch of interests gathered together and got the exact process they want. What you often have is a process meant for a very different thing that is now running in a very different way. This is not exactly on the supply side liberalism topic, but I think a lot about how the ballot initiative process in California was created by the progressive movement in the early 1900s because the railroad interests had bought up the entire legislature. And then a couple of years ago, it is used by Uber and Lyft, who in certain ways, I think one could imagine as being modern day successors of past very large transportation interests, to put down a constitutional amendment saying that no alterations can be made around how we think about their employees, except with a 7/8 vote of supermajority of the legislature. Now, maybe you love that requirement, maybe you don't, but whatever the ballot initiative process was meant to do, it was not that. It's kind of working in the exact opposite way. So you also just do have this reality of long-running processes getting captured by whoever happens to be around and have the resources to capture them. And sometimes that's people who want money out of it. Sometimes people want preservation, sometimes safety, whatever it might be, environmental standards. But it does create a kind of difficulty in getting anything done. So I think of this as kind of a socio-political dial that has been set really high across a lot of different areas of society. But unlike in some other things I've covered, if you want the Senate to move faster, you could really just get rid of the filibuster. There isn't like the one thing here, right? There isn't the one statute I would change, the one ballot initiative I would repeal, the one sort of layer of this I would like elevate up to state government as opposed to local government. It's really very case by case. And the fact that it happens in so many places, in so many different ways, I think speaks to there being a kind of more generalized force and sort of social evolution behind it, as opposed to being just like one mistake by a bunch of bad decision makers somewhere.
Hey, everybody. I want to recommend a couple other shows that we also run. One is Moment of Zen, which I co-host with Dan Romero and Antonio Garcia Martinez. We talk about everything from tech to history, philosophy. We've also featured Marc Andreessen and Biology on those podcasts, so I recommend you checking them out. My other show is Cognitive Revolution. It's an AI show that I co-host with Nathan Lebens. I recommend listening if you want to stay up to date with all things AI.
Secureframe is the leading all-in-one platform for security and privacy compliance. Get SOC 2 audit ready in weeks, not months. I believe in Secureframe so much that I invested in it, and I recommend it to all my portfolio companies. Sign up for a free demo and mention Upstream during your demo to get 20% off your first year. Now, more than ever, startup founders need a safe place to put their cash. Mercury protects your money and also provides the streamlined user experience that great founders expect. Through partner banks and their sweep networks, Mercury offers up to $5 million in FDIC insurance, which is 20 times the per bank limit. They also make it easy to invest any cash above the FDIC insured amount in a money market fund. 100,000 startups trust Mercury with their finances. I've been a happy Mercury customer and have found their team incredibly helpful and responsive. They even got an important wire out of purgatory on Christmas Eve. After all, your Christmas is my opportunity. Visit Mercury.com to get started. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC. MarketerHire is one of my favorite resources for startups looking to hire marketers. With thousands of pre-vetted marketers across a dozen roles, MarketerHire matches you to your perfect marketer in 48 hours. Whether you need help with growth marketing, SEO, lifecycle, content, or any other aspect of your marketing strategy, MarketerHire has you covered. So if you're a founder looking for top-notch marketing talent to help grow your startup, head over to MarketerHire.com to find your perfect match. Sign up with referral code UPSTREAM and you'll get $1,000 credit on your first hire.
It is interesting. During sort of June 2020, after George Floyd, there was this sort of demand for reformation of how police unions work, and I'm curious if you could imagine things that would also cause people to think about the teachers union or other kinds of organizations that some people might be think might be holding back supply in some way. I actually don't know enough about teachers union to say whether they are or aren't, but it was just interesting that was
an episode that caused insight into or a desired change on a structural level. And I'm curious if you think we might see more of that.
I think the more worrying lesson of that is I think police unions have properly been understood as having played some genuinely grotesque roles in American society, right? As somebody who is often supportive of the labor movement, I think the particular role police unions have played and the particular way their cultures have evolved are very worrying. And how much reform did we actually see after that? I mean, for all of that energy, for all that in the street protest, where are we now? And I would say not that much further, not that much different. I mean, look at the videos that have come out of Nichols' death. So, look, I think on the one hand, you could certainly say that there has been energy for various reasons for systemic reform. I mean, like when I was in DC in the aughts, that was a period of huge ferment around education reform, as it was called. God, what was the name of our um, chancellor there who was on the cover of Time? She was an education reformer. I'm just blanking on her name. I'm sorry about that. But she was a kind of like an anti-teachers union education reformer. She was on the cover of Time. You know, Bill Gates was putting all this money into it. Like there was this huge thing of a fight with the teachers unions. It led to the race to the top reforms and other things. So we've had moments like this. I mean, certainly YIMBYs in California are a reaction. I mean, to me, when I talk about supply side liberalism, I am doing something descriptive as much as I am doing something proscriptive. Like I am saying this is happening, that you can see a lot of its tendrils emerging. I mean, the sort of original article I did on this, I think it's called The Economic Mistake the Left is Finally Confronting. I describe it explicitly there as saying this is occurring. Like if you look at different things occurring, you can see something emergent out of that. And I'm trying to name the emergence. And then obviously I have my views about how it should shape and evolve. So one, I think we're seeing that. Two, I think we've seen it in some of these areas in the past. And three, I think that the very analogy you give should be sobering to anybody who thinks, even with a lot of energy that reform is easy or assured.
Yeah. So you're saying on the federal level, there's some structural reforms like the filibuster. On a local level, it's much more particular and harder to find kind of generalizable things. And so when you see Silicon Valley or people like David Sachs or others kind of enter kind of local politics in a more serious way in terms of getting involved, in terms of advocacy, what do you think that they don't quite understand when they apply kind of perhaps the Silicon Valley perspective to local politics?
It depends on the person. I'm not, to be honest, familiar with David Sachs's local advocacy, but some of them do, I think, a good job. Like there's a group, the sort of, I'll get their name wrong. It's like the Coalition for Effective Governance or something, but Misha Chelem and that crew. Yeah. I don't agree with them on literally everything, but I think they're serious. I think they're trying to understand how the system works and where the choke points are and who to work with and how to figure it out. And I think, we'll see where that evolves into, but I think they're doing a good job of that. I don't my point is not to sit here and say this is all too complicated to get involved with. I actually think the point is you should get involved locally, and you can identify the difficulty in doing something in San Francisco or something in Fresno in a way that it's hard to say across the entire country, this is what we would do about it. Or this is like the generalizable way to say, here's how we would fix it. To my thinking, some of what we're doing, me and Derek, with, this book and this project more broadly is I think of it as a lens more than I think of it as a prescription. So, going back to sort of my early pieces on this, at the most basic level, I'm just trying to create the question of, or I'm just trying to pose a question of, do progressives do a good job at noticing when their goals are being thwarted by supply side obstruction or slowness or insufficiency in the same way they do on the demand side, right? I think progressives are very good at looking around the economy and saying, hey, people cannot afford health insurance or housing or education, whatever, and we want to try to subsidize that for them, right? Subsidizing on the demand side in basically any domain you can think of is something progressives do in many, many different ways. Vouchers and, cash transfers and all kinds of different things, right? We do not, I think about production nearly as much, and we do not think about innovation nearly as much. And so some of it is saying, here's a lens, and here are some examples that then, having that example in your head, maybe you see a similar example in the city you live in or in the industry you're in or nationally or whatever it might be. On some level, this is almost a set of metaphors to be applied as much as it is more than it is a guidebook, exactly, or more than it is an attempt to be comprehensive.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me about this, so it's interpreted as pro growth, pro technology. To your point about the politics of technology, and it seems to me bipartisan, both in terms of there are people on both sides who agree with it, but also people on both sides who are uncomfortable with it. Both perhaps some of the environmentalists on the left, but also some other groups. But then also on the right, you're also seeing this kind of like deeply skeptical of tech, skeptical of growth. The sort of, Patrick Deneen on your podcast, that was a fascinating episode. The guys at Compact. How do you think about kind of this like almost reorientation on these topics?
So my first book is about polarization, and I think two things from that are very relevant here. So one thing I do like about this is that I think it is a productive cleavage, right?
Yep.
As opposed to an unproductive cleavage that is like long ago got into a place where nobody's going to move on it. That said, a dynamic I'm pointing out in the first book, and that will happen here too, and already has happened in some areas, is the more this becomes a central issue, the more the parties will figure out which side they're on. So, I mean, we've definitely seen this around single-family zoning over the past couple of years. Think back to when Trump was in office and to the California race here, the recall race. As progressives have moved towards being explicitly against single-family zoning, Republicans are moving much more into a defense of single-family zoning. And so if single-family zoning becomes like the hot issue, I don't think it will be bipartisan for very long at all. And I mean, they're always individuals, right? But these things have a tendency to find in a polarized political system for people to figure out how to organize around the cleavage. But so long as it is existing in kind of the back of politics, or it's more salient in places with one-party government, like California is, then it can have this sort of unusual, strange bedfellows coalition. So that part of it is, I think, fun and valuable and interesting right now. I'm not unbelievably confident in it sustaining itself. And that's particularly true because, again, for me, a lot of these things are yoked to particular values. So housing is a little bit different because it is so local and state oriented an issue. But if you think of clean energy, which is something I've spent a lot of time on in this area, clean energy is a highly partisan coded question.
Yeah.
Or if you think about alternative proteins, meat is a highly culturally coded question that people desperately want to turn into a partisan one, right? There was a whole thing when the Green New Deal came out about how they were going to ban hamburgers. Then there was something about Joe Biden banning red meat. And of course, like Joe Biden, not a vegetarian in any way, not an animal rights guy, not going to ban meat. But it's all to say that the number of things I've watched go from, oh, what an interesting bipartisan issue with a lot of cross-cutting coalitions to nope, same fight as always is high. So I'm a little bit jaded on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting when the topics kind of shift. The right, it feels like used to be more free market on immigration and trade among other issues, and the left maybe used to be slightly more protectionist around some of these topics. It is, to the extent that shift has happened, feel free to correct that. Is it best explained by the right? By the population shifting, in that the right represents a little bit more of the working class, at least from a non-college educated perspective, or how do you see that?
The immigration shift, I think, happened before the working class shift on the right. So you can go back to, say, 2005, or no, this was in 2007, I think it was. And you can see the division in the party on this even then. But George W. Bush and John McCain push this big immigration reform bill, and the bill is destroyed by a revolt coming out of conservative talk radio. And so it's like a conservative revolt against a Republican bill that ends up doing that project. So for various reasons, I think the right has been, as immigration has become a more polarized issue, the home of anti-immigration sentiment. I mean, Pat Buchanan was running as a Republican in like 1988, and was obviously a Republican before that. So I don't think that is that new. Now, the sort of dominance of the anti-immigration sentiment in the Republican Party, that's newer, and that emerges, I think, basically that's Donald Trump. If Donald Trump doesn't run in 2016, I don't know who wins the nomination, but I think it's plausible you have like a Marco Rubio or a Jeb Bush or a Chris Christie. And all of them had very, very different views on immigration. And so I think that division within the Republican Party would not have been settled in the way it was settled by Donald Trump's victory, where sort of he ran, I don't want to say a single issue candidacy, but a candidacy essentially on immigration and free trade. And so I guess it's also kind of my answer for free trade. I think these were issues that had always divided the parties internally. Both parties were quite split. I mean, Bernie Sanders was a skeptic of liberal immigration bills and a skeptic of free trade. And you could find Republicans who were like that, and you could find Democrats and Republicans who were the opposite. And Trump so fully associating the Republican Party with an attack on immigration, that made Democrats much more liberal on immigration. The interesting thing is that the skepticism of free trade, I think, has persisted. So unlike immigration, where basically Trump polarized the parties around it, and Democrats became vastly more liberal on immigration by the end of Trump's presidency than they were before it, in general. Free trade, you see Trump runs, and like Hillary Clinton sort of absurdly comes out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which clearly she was somewhat involved with as Secretary of State and as part of the administration. And the Democratic Party never turned around on that. They have kind of maintained that position, right? It's not like Biden is, resuscitating TPP. And the same is true on China. Biden has been, if anything, significantly tougher on China, at least on a policy perspective, than Trump had been. Biden has gone places which I'm, to be honest, uncomfortable with. Like the view that we should hinder China's progress on semiconductors, not really because they're a national security technology, although they are that on some level, but just because we don't want them to get too good at technology too quickly. I'm not saying I can't see the logic of it, but it is a hell of an escalation. And like, it's sort of remarkable. There's a great Politico piece about China trade policy under Biden. And you have these Trump national security people being like, we would like, that is way beyond where we thought it was reasonable to be. And it's at least worth thinking about what that means. And I'm trying to do some thinking about what that means. So maybe I'm getting further afield from your question here, but it is interesting to think about the ones where one party takes a really striking position on an issue and that polarizes it, versus there are occasional cases where a party comes out, sort of reverses on an issue, and that becomes something like the new consensus. And on free trade in China, I think that's more or less been the case.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like if we were to go back, a year or two and say, hey, one side is going to be pro, Ukraine, and one side is going to be anti-Ukraine, or kind of take whatever big schism, it's not always obvious which side is going to come out on which topic. And some of it is just kind of path dependent on, who Trump picks first or someone else kind of picks first. And then the other side has to take the opposition.
I think that's right.
Yeah. To that end, if your book on polarization were written in 2023, would you have added or edited anything? And I'm just curious, just what's changed as regards to this, or what's changed in your thinking as it regards to this?
I think it mostly holds up pretty well. I was really pleased to see what a strong 2022 the book had, to be honest, where it got on the Bill Gates and Obama summer reading list, despite coming out a few years before. I didn't expect that. So anybody listening should feel confident picking it up, because also what I'm about to say is now in the afterword that I was able to put on the new edition. But the main thing that I didn't talk enough about was education as a locus of polarization, as a dimension of polarization. So I talk a lot about different things we can be polarized on. And the one I don't talk enough about in the early version of the book is education. And one reason I don't, and obviously I would now, but I still find education very hard to talk about in any kind of precise way, because education seems to me to be a correlate for something we don't really understand. Like, it is our best way of tracking something that we're trying to get at that has become a very, very important driver of polarization, but it's not exactly it. So this is one reason why all the polls didn't suddenly work between 2016 and 2020 after the pollsters adjusted for education, because education was picking up something that is some miasma, but was not fully representing something that is a miasma of like low trust in institutions and a kind of cultural conservatism, like what Pippa Norris would call a cultural backlash. And the difference in politics right now is not what you learn when you attend Ohio State University, right? And I think it's really important to remember when you think about college education, most people are not going to Ivy League colleges. They're not going to the top 50 colleges in U.S. News and World Report. They're going to state colleges or colleges a lot of people haven't heard of, and they're getting a degree in marketing. And maybe that college is more liberal than you would like to think it is, like maybe, Cal Poly, whatever, but it's not that liberal. It just isn't. And that's not what they're doing there for that matter. And so there's something being picked up that is more than just the Marxists in the sociology department at Yale are indoctrinating all the kids in post-colonial theory.
Yeah.
But we don't really know what it is. I've done podcasts and explored the idea that maybe it's class, right? Education is maybe a closer correlate of class now than anything else is. Not because it's making you so liberal, but because it is kind of acculturating you to a certain set of manners and mores, and that doesn't make you super woke, but it does make you kind of repelled by these other things. It's very hard to figure out, but education definitely would be the thing I would have wanted to explore more deeply.
Yeah. On the topic of institutional distrust, I'm curious whether you think there's more explanatory power in the idea that, hey, there's been this kind of, fear mongering among, sort of institutional decline, or whether the institutions themselves have just become sclerotic for being around for so long and not needing to innovate, or maybe that, there's been a kind of platform shift with the internet and they're no longer kind of set up for success in that era. What do you think is most explanatory for institutional distrust?
Well, it depends a little bit on what we're trying to explain. So if you want to look at a trend line of institutional distrust, the big fall happens before the internet. So I think a lot of us would want to look at the last couple of years, and so would I, because I think something important is happening. But that's not a little bit like social media can't explain polarization, because most of the rise in polarization happens way before social media. And that doesn't mean it's not worsening it or accelerating it or changing it or amplifying it now. But when I wrote my book, I got all these so is it Facebook? I was like, it can't be Facebook, because this began decades ago. I think there's a bit of that for institutions. I would say the interesting thing about institutions is that we are polarizing around institutional trust. Yeah. So compared to, I just wrote a piece about this, compared to, let's call it 15 or 20 years ago, let's call it the George W. Bush era. You would say, I would have said back then that the anti-institutional strain in American life was more mixed between the two parties. So it is true, Republicans really didn't like the media. They didn't like kind of elite universities. They didn't like a couple other things we could name. But Democrats didn't like big business. And Democrats didn't like, right? And you could kind of go through that. And I would say now there's a more kind of holistic anti-institutional type in the Republican Party, right? Which is reflected in many ways by the turn against big tech and big business and cronyism. And, Kevin McCarthy saying that he doesn't even think he hasn't heard from the Chamber of Commerce in forever. Do they even have any power around here anymore? And you also see it. I think there's a very weird, I never know exactly how to characterize it and won't try, but this kind of anti-institutional, almost anti-big business thing happening among tech executives who themselves run or sit on the boards of big businesses. And I do think there's a very profound, almost Marxist, capital being really mad at labor thing playing out in Silicon Valley, which has made a lot of these folks anti-institutional because they dislike their own institutions and feel unappreciated. And their employees are always haranguing them and they can all organize on Slack now. And being a manager at a certain kind of visible, highly educated workforce, company has just become a lot less fun than it was, I think, 15 or 20 years ago. I'm not saying it wasn't hard 15 or 20 years ago, but what it means to be an upper level manager at a major media technology, finance, some kind of high labor force power, highly visible industry, it's really changed. It's led to a lot of resentment and a lot of backlash among the people on top of that. So I would just note too, there's just a very weird, the anti-institutionalism of Elon Musk and that particular class of VCs around him is a not unknown. I mean, you can find a lot of examples of this historically, but is a fascinating turn because from a different perspective, they are the institutions, but it's always been more complicated than that. And it is now too. But yeah, that's the main thing I would say. I think more than there's been a tremendous change in institutional trust in the past 10 years or 15 years, although there has been some, and things like the Supreme Court that were high are now low. I think what's more interesting is that there is a concentration of, it used to have like a mix of which institutions the two sides trusted, and Democrats are significantly more aligned with business now than they were, and Republicans significantly more against it, and basically like disaligned with every major institutional structure in ways that, you know, we can talk through the implications of it, but I think they're quite profound, actually.
Yeah, it is interesting. Just the different factions within tech that are kind of forming. My friend Nadia Asparova has she separates it as such. There's the Davos tech elite, and it maybe puts like Gates or even Zuckerberg to some degree, or and they are trying to spread liberal democracy via kind of international organizations. Then there's kind of the founder mindset or startup elite, and that's like it's time to build the Marc Andreessen, the Elon, and there's some versions of that are more right wing than others. But then there's also the crypto elite that are trying to the Vitaliks of the world that are trying to do something pretty different, and they're trying to do like via a different structural. They're trying to have decentralized public goods or kind of this Web3 vision. And it's interesting to see people float among the different camps and see how that plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would have to spend some real time thinking about my taxonomy. I think like Davos tech is correct. I think there's definitely that sort of more institutional tech, Tim Cook, right?
Yeah.
I think I would want to cut the founders into some different categories here.
Yeah.
The politics of Elon Musk and some of the people like that are very different than the politics of a lot of individual founders, but there are, I think, two real camps of that. Like I think there's a sort of left founder culture emergent and a right and a reactionary, a right founder culture emergent, and they're really, really in tension with each other now. But I think that the right founder culture has become very much about, in a way that people almost like don't really want to directly look into. It's very much a backlash against their own employees. I mean, it's completely clear. And this is something I've always been completely fascinated by, actually. I mean, you think of it like a Brian Armstrong at Coinbase, just the level of frustration with what it is people are talking about in Slack in your own company, mixed with, to me, this sort of interesting unwillingness to take a sort of the medium is a message attitude towards what it means to have invented and helped like fund things like Slack or rolled them out is really, it's fascinating. So I found the whole Basecamp kerfluffle of like a couple, I don't remember when it was now, but really interesting. I mean, they created, I get what's in it. Is Basecamp the name of the company or was that the product? Campfire was a product, right?
Yes. The company's Basecamp.
So Basecamp is a company. Campfire was like a precursor. I understood it at a certain point as a precursor to HipChat, but then HipChat became a precursor to Slack and to Teams and the rest of it. And and everybody's like, oh, this is going to democratize everything, and we're going to make it possible for everybody to talk. And then you did, and it's like, oh my God, what are these people saying? And this created, I think, first there's an effort to mandate it out of existence, right? You can't talk about politics anymore, like on the work Slack. And then, I mean, a lot of this was happening on Twitter, so it gets like literally bought by Elon Musk. Yeah. And there's just something very interesting playing out in the labor politics that I think is sort of masquerading as other kinds of politics, but are a real conflict between labor and capital here. And then crypto is interesting. I mean, Vitalik is to me, and I quite like Vitalik, and he's been on my podcast, and he's a little bit of a distinctive figure. And I think I'm not sure what crypto elite means today versus what it meant a year ago. And I mean, does Chris Dixon count as crypto elite, right? Do all the VCs who are pumping money into it not count as crypto elite? What about Brian, like, et cetera, et cetera? But I think that there is within crypto a lot of different subgenres between like the crypto utopians who are not that interested in crypto as a financialization mechanism and the sort of crypto financiers who are, these are very different and to me somewhat irresolvable visions of this. I mean, something that I have often talked about with people in crypto is that you cannot solve the problems of capitalism, which is often what people are ideologically talking about, with a technology that builds hyper financialized capitalism into its core structure. You could solve other problems, right? Like you very well might be able to make remittances more efficient. But the idea that big Web 2 firms emerged and like developed a lot of power and then wielded that power in ways people don't like, and yet we've created another power concentrating thing with unequal financial rewards, like that you then need to create middleman institutions to make safe and usable, that then become things that the same VCs who invested in Web 2 and the whole thing was so like weird from the beginning that there's a kind of, I think, irresolvable tension at its heart for now. And which side, if either of them wins out through that, or what kind of synthesis can emerge, is really, really going to be significant. And I think it's not quite knowable at the moment. And then I would just finally say that it's very easy. Some of this all feels old to me when we're talking about, obviously there's a lot of new news about Elon Musk and others, but certainly my impression is that there's a set of technologies that are emergent now that are different and have different internal political dynamics than all the people who ran like social media and smartphone based either hardware or software companies. So Musk is one of them, to be fair, but I think the amount of energy and investment now going into AI is obviously one area. And I think we really don't know what those business models will be. And like that will really affect how that evolves. But green tech in particular, alt proteins for a while, we'll see where that goes. I do think there's been a little bit of a move towards trying to solve other kinds of problems technologically. And my sense from knowing those industries a bit and people in them a bit is they have very, very different dynamics than both the founders and the financiers of like what you might call Web 2.
Yeah. That in what sense? Or say more about that.
I just think they're focused on other kinds of problems.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, I don't love Web 2, but I think that basically a set of personalities who emerged in the Web 2 era, and Elon is one of those people. But all these guys you're talking about are. That is a maturing industry in a way, and a maturing culture that has now developed, as maturing industries and maturing cultures do, a set of like resentments and enmities and concerns and questions and incumbents and whatever. And if you're somebody like working on next generation wind turbines or trying to figure out how to make like algae that does such and such for carbon in the atmosphere, people working on direct air capture, the people working on, like how to create cultivated fish, right? Make fish out of cultivated cells that has a texture. They just like have a different set of concerns, in part because they don't, I think, have quite as much time to sit around like fighting out related but not quite on point culture wars when you have a lot of like hard technological problems to solve. I don't want to be too idyllic about it because obviously like all these things will change and people who work on all kinds of things have their own political opinions. But one thing I think has a little bit happened is that the people who dominated like the last cycle of technology, the problems they were trying to solve have now matured into not that interesting and their attention is a little bit elsewhere. Right. Even when their problems are still very interesting. I think the problems for Tesla and SpaceX are interesting, but clearly Elon Musk's attention is somewhat elsewhere. Whereas the people who are building things that they're not Mark Zuckerberg yet, they actually still have to build the fucking thing.
Yeah.
And totally. So they don't actually have a ton of time either from the Davos or the right-wing founder perspective to like have a million other side battles on every topic under the sun. Like the question of like who's pissing you off on Twitter today is just like a little smaller. That's my impression. Maybe I'm wrong.
No,
you would know this a lot better than me, frankly.
Yeah, I think you're right. And part of it's just they don't have to focus on content moderation because that doesn't affect their everyday, as much as, running these platforms or investing in these platforms. I think your point about the labor versus capital is spot on, and it's no coincidence that James Burnham has become a kind of cult author in Silicon Valley. He talks about the differences between sort of manager interests and owner interests, and it is because it's interesting that this right founder sort of class has emerged when they don't typically have like right wing position, like they're not pro life, they're not like anti immigration or something, they're not against gay marriage. And so how are they actually right? It's just that they're kind of standing up against maybe like social or sort of leftism that they think has gone too far within their companies, probably.
So I read about this a lot a couple of years ago when the intellectual dark web was more of a thing
Yeah.
people talked about before it split in
Yeah.
like a total catastrophe of vaccine conspiracy
Yeah.
theorizing. But you would hear this all the time where people who were clearly on the right side, the RI, no, it's not differently spelled, clearly on the, what I would call the reactionary, but I want to say that in a kind of value neutral
Yeah.
way because it's a very loaded term, reactionary side of the political divide. Like, how can I be a right winger? Like, I might be, to use the most extreme example, because this was not the intellectual dark web, but you would have people like Richard Spence back then, who was like an actual white supremacist, be like,
Yeah.
I'm pro universal healthcare. Like, how can I be a right winger? And it's a mistake, I think, to be overly literal about the way politics is organized in Washington, D.C. And the fact that one of the recurrent cleavages, like the most persistent cleavage going back to James Burnham and way before that, that on some level, like the left and the right are defined by either a kind of appetite for and excitement about the way power is changing or shifting or could be changed and shifted in society versus a revulsion towards or an opposition towards the way power is changing and shifting and could change and shift in society. Like, that's not something that Silicon Valley invented in some interesting way in the year of our Lord 2019. It just isn't. So the idea that you have a huge backlash across this country, but you see it here too, towards a set of social and power changes that come as a direct outgrowth of very, very, very rapid demographic change, right? A rapid browning of America, an increase of like the number of foreign-born residents from something like 4% in the 1970s to something like 16, 17% around now. I've not looked at those numbers in a year or two, so I could have that a little bit off. A majority of infants, in the country are non-white now. That's a huge, I mean, we don't always know exactly how to translate that into politics, but
Yeah.
basically, are you comfortable with the fact that this country is demographically changing very fast, or are you not? Has created a tremendous amount of political ferment. And oftentimes, like a kind of gut reaction to that is really where people fall. And it takes some time for that to get translated into a kind of coherent politics. It's not that related to how you feel about universal healthcare being a good example, actually. And then the labor capital thing is also, and then somehow these two things have merged, right? In the way that political coalitions often merge somewhat unrelated demands. Like,
Yeah.
why are the people who care the most about climate change also the people who want abortion to be legal? It's not like a super great answer to that question, except for the dynamics of coalitions
Yeah.
and polarization and kind of political alliances and information ecosystems and so on. And I think that's basically what has happened here too. I mean, I do think this sort of, I don't know what to call the sort of Andreessen Musk politics versus what to call the sort of, but I mean, at the center of that is a very, very pitched battle that is simultaneously about how social mores are changing and how like labor and capital are fighting it out. And weird things are getting grafted onto that, but it's a very old kind of fight.
Yeah. To that end, someone else who wrote a book about polarization the last few years is Chris Caldwell, and you wrote about it. I'll hear from you about it in a second. But Chris Caldwell, one of his ideas is that the civil rights actually, created sort of a competing constitution that kind of exposed the tensions or potential tensions within liberalism around freedom and equality, and thus we've been duking it out kind of ever since of these competing constitutions. And Richard Hanania has a related post where he says wokeness is just civil rights law, and the fact that companies have moved to the left somehow, is explained by its employees moving to the left, but in other ways, it's accelerated by just companies just trying to follow the law. I'm curious if you're sympathetic with any of that as a possible explanation.
I would want to go read the Hanania post before I commented on it because I haven't read that. Caldwell's thesis I'm familiar with. I haven't read the whole book, and it's been a while since I looked at it at all. I don't remember finding it very convincing when I read it. in part just because I think we're dealing with a lot of downstream functions, and you would want reasons things were happening at certain times in certain places. And I just find raw demographics then amplified by sort of attentional and youth oriented industries to be a much more persuasive factor. I just think you can't follow these fights and not notice they're typically much more pitched, and they start, even if they eventually end elsewhere, at the cultural level. So the fights over like Nike choosing, a sort of a football player who is also understood as being very outspoken on civil rights as a spokesperson, and then like a lot of Republicans burning their Nikes. I think you're just missing something if you over literalize into policy all the time. And the idea that these are two competing constitutions never struck me as what was at their core. Also, sort of the idea that we weren't having obvious relatives of these fights when we had a very different kind of constitution dominant in this country a couple of years. Anyway, but because I've not read Caldwell's full book or like seen it for a couple of years, I don't want to get too deep into the guts of that argument because he might have counters on some of these and I'm not being fair to.
Sure. Shifting gears a bit, Roy Teixeira and David Shore have written about how, they come from the left and they are worried that in some areas the left has gone too far left, that it is hurting their electoral chances in certain policies, certain races. I'm curious if you are sympathetic with that analysis or where you differ from them.
So I wrote a 6,000-word piece about David Shore and the kind of fights over popularism in the Democratic Party. So I've kind of allowed a lot of different voices to speak through me there. The place I've come out on that is, it is obviously true that political coalitions, let me say what I agree with David. One, that the Democratic Party, in particular, they're not alone, has a significant representational problem in who staffs it, in terms of what their politics are compared to the median voter. But that's also, by the way, true for the Republican Party. The Democratic Party also often takes positions on things that are quite unpopular or just quite a little bit odd. But also the Republican Party has more or less united around denial of the 2020 election. So the reason I keep bringing up the Republican Party like this is to note that it's actually very hard to police parties in the way that he is implying is possible. So it is true that you could probably do a better job of tracking the median voter if you're a Democrat. It's also true you could do that if you're a Republican. And I think in general, Democrats have been a lot better at it. Like, who actually does win the Democratic primary in 2020? Oh, it's like Joe Biden, like old, known to be moderate, et cetera. And then I am very skeptical. A place where I differ with David, where I differ with my friend Matt Iglesias. I've been a policy reporter for my whole career. I think the level of policy literalism, a lot of their arguments imply in the population, just has no basis in fact. Obviously, there's some, right? That is one of the things that makes it through. But if you asked me which would have a bigger effect, getting people who have a certain, to go back to our conversation about education, getting people who have a certain sort of cultural vibe around them, for lack of a better term, versus getting people who seem the same but have more moderate positions. I would say the first one almost every time. I think a really good example of that is Fetterman in Pennsylvania, who in general is extremely, extremely liberal. And if he had not suffered the stroke, he suffered the stroke and won a quite big victory anyway in what could have been a very tough race. I think if he had not suffered the stroke, it's possible he could have completely stomped Dr. Oz. Yeah. And it's not because, Matt will point out that there are places where he moderates. And of course, that's true, as it is for every politician. But in general, he's an extremely liberal politician who nevertheless vibes like he's a guy who would back you up in a bar fight. And which is all only to say that I think that the difficulties the Democratic Party, and for that matter, again, the Republican Party sometimes have, are more about whether or not the sort of tribunes of their politics are people who, like, kind of the median voter, whoever that is, if that's even a relevant kind of concept, given the way we fracture elections, are people those voters connect to more than it is like every individual policy proposal they have. I've often said that I think the thing the popularists miss when they talk about this is that everything in the end is about unpopularism. because for anybody to hear about anything, this is a big point of my book. It's actually very hard to get any kind of message out anywhere. Because for anybody to hear anything, it has to be something that generates controversy. What ends up mattering, what people hear about you, are the positions you take that inspire opposition. For some time, Shore was like a big Bernie Sanders proponent because Sanders had a pretty high favorability rating compared to other politicians. And one thing that's always been interesting about Bernie Sanders compared to a lot of other politicians is he will always bite the bullet, almost always, on his own positions. So why did Bernie's healthcare positions dominate virtually every single Democratic debate in 2020? And the reason is that he was always willing to say, I will abolish all private health insurance and I will raise taxes on middle-class people. And by biting those bullets, he was able to create a conflict that gave him agenda control. And so the really, if you have a bunch of popular positions but no agenda control, you really don't have that much in the end. What you need is agenda control in addition to positions that ultimately make people side with you. And so the question of where you're willing to say something unpopular that creates conflict with your own side or creates conflict in the country at large becomes really central. And, I do think that one of the things that they are right about, to circle back to a place of agreement, is it is almost always better for Democrats to try to create conflict around economic messages than sociocultural ones. And they've probably not been doing an ideal job of that in recent years. But it is something they've been doing more of. And, a lot of the positions that certainly Joe Biden has taken, for whatever his failures as a communicator are, they are efforts to create these kinds of arguments. The final thing I would say is that I do think social media has changed this a lot on both sides. So when you think about who defines a party, compared to when I entered politics, the leadership of parties is much less powerful, with the exception maybe of the president, in defining parties. And the people who are effective attention entrepreneurs, Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene, or whoever you might imagine on the right, a kind of squad, et cetera on the left, they've just become much more important. So I have quite conservative family members and people I talk to regularly, and it really doesn't matter there what Joe Biden is saying exactly in general. They are watching Fox News or listening to conservative media, and they are getting the most inflammatory things said by the most inflammatory Democrats. And if you are a liberal listening to MSNBC, you're getting something of the reverse. And that just creates a real difficulty for parties as organizations that nobody, I think, is anywhere really even close to solving. I think the only way to solve it is to hold the presidency with a very aggressive, talented communicator. And recently Republicans held the presidency with a not very talented, but very aggressive, or at least not very strategic. He is very talented.
Say the least.
A not very strategic, but highly aggressive communicator. And now Democrats have the presidency and they have a highly strategic, but not very talented communicator in it. And so, what you want functionally is to have Barack Obama. But generationally talented politicians don't come along very often.
What is the right mental model for thinking about the powers of a president? What is the president actually capable of doing versus not? You have someone like Elon coming into Twitter and he lets go, rightly or wrongly, a huge chunk of the Twitter staff, and you kind of see what are the powers of a CEO. How do we think about what is the president actually capable of?
I mean, it depends. Joe Biden could launch airstrikes on China tomorrow. What he could not do tomorrow is make a minuscule change to the federal tax code. I mean, it's a very weird thing, a weird way we've set it up. And so the powers are, you get old things, right? Like Richard Neustadt, the power of the presidency is power to persuade, et cetera. I'm not even sure it's that anymore. The power of the president is very different in different domains. It is very different in conditions of divided and unified government. It is very different if you control the Supreme Court and if you don't. And it's very different depending on the match between president and communication medium. And so I don't know that there is as much one answer to that as people want there to be. But I guess in general, domestically, the president's power is much more limited than people want to believe it is. And on foreign policy, it's much more expansive than it probably should be. And then attentionally, it's very mixed. You can get attention, but often not for what you want attention for. And the more you make things a center of the agenda because of various dynamics of polarization, the more you will increase backlash to your own proposals. It's a tough job.
Yeah. And when people talk about the deep state, they often kind of catastrophizing, or worse. But is it right to think about this sort of quasi-permanent government employee class that is neither accountable to the market nor democratic mechanisms?
I mean, there's definitely a civil service. I think when people call it the deep state, like it's making it sound somewhat more mysterious than it actually is. Yeah. Like there are people who work in offices, and as we were just talking about labor and capital in Silicon Valley, there's a deep state in Silicon Valley too that has infuriated all the bosses. And yes, you can take over a company with your own money and fire a bunch of people, but in 5 or 10 years, he may not be able to do that even at his own company. Like I think he'd have more trouble doing that at Tesla today than he did in a unusual takeover of Twitter. Yeah, I mean, there is a state. Actually, when I initially conceived of my first book, and it had a kind of different structure back then, it was called The Deep State. Way prior, this is 2011, I think it was, like way prior to Trump taking that term. Everybody's like, you can't use that. That's a term from Turkey. Like nobody's gonna, okay.
Wow.
But yeah, look, there is on the one hand, a federal bureaucracy that needs to be used and deployed if you're going to do things, right? The president doesn't run around carrying out the activities of the federal government by themselves. That, due to civil service protections and other things, it has some insulation on certain issues. And also, unless you're being pretty extreme and typically like running afoul of the law or something, a talented administrator can move it in their direction, but even the most talented administrator, even when there's alignment between them and the state, cannot move it as fast as they would like. So I remember talking to Ron Klain about pandemic policy, and I remember him saying, I forgot what the exact point, but it was a very vivid way he put this, where he's like, even when you are the president and people are like on the same side as you on an issue, and you stand up on the table yelling, this is the most important thing, you still may not be able to get the whole bureaucracy to activate in the way you want it to. So I think it got complicated. I think it got very complicated in the way people saw it because of Trump, who was not really trying to run it. He was more comfortable being in opposition to it than he was to being in charge of it. It's been a long time frustration of Democrats or Republicans come in and are able to use the thing for their purposes. So, you think of a more talented administrator, I don't know. Which is all to say that I'm sort of shadow boxing with what I think you're asking me about the deep state. And the answer is that the deep state, like any bureaucracy, is very complicated. And one of the funny things is it often is very frustrating for liberals who want to get things done because it's sclerotic and rules bound in other ways. And so it's like the problem for liberals is it follows the rules too much. And then the problem for, conservatives, but sometimes their advantage is like they don't care about the rules and will go around them in a way the liberals often won't. And so, it just kind of depends.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sometimes I hear in the crypto community something along the lines of, hey, it's possible that this tech might not do much or might not be that transformative. But what is possible, kind of incidentally, is that it will encourage a lot of regulation innovation, because you're kind of working outside the system and then forcing new regulation, and innovating on regulations that were written 100 years ago or 50 years ago that don't make sense today. And so it's kind of like a cynical take on why crypto might still work. And to the extent that that's true, it's interesting to see if there's like some version of that will exist in other spaces where there's just kind of like a opportunity to reset and say, hey, we've had these regulations or these kind of bureaucratic institutions were created 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and they did some great stuff, but they're not built for this era.
Maybe.
No.
I think we'll have to see if they're effective in doing that.
Yeah,
but I don't think that would be a bad thing. I mean, a lot of regulations could use updating, so like that's not a crazy theory. You'd have to be a little less ham-handed in how you go about things. Because you could get the opposite, right? If you're crypto, particularly right now, and given the reputation, you could get a tightening of things you don't want tightened.
Yeah. The The last camp, this is a segue into basically the Patrick Collison progress studies camp. We've talked about kind of the other different kinds of camps that exist. I'm curious, there's a lot of alignment, and you had a great episode with Patrick on your work and his work. Where do you perhaps differ with him?
With Patrick, so I'm obviously just much more sympathetic to the progress studies people. And I think one thing I'll say about progress studies is people underestimate, I think, how important kind of intellectual and interpersonal virtues are in different cultures. And just one thing that I give Patrick and Tyler, who I think are sort of the founding players of progress studies, going back to that Atlantic article, a lot of credit for, is I think progress studies to a large extent share some of their intellectual virtues. There are two people who I have disagreements with them, probably more significantly with Tyler. I know Patrick, well enough, but like, I don't know Patrick's not been blogging like all day, every day for 1,000 years in the way me and Tyler have now. So like, I just know Tyler's views on like every policy in a way I don't know Patrick's. But they both have, I think, a kind of notable intellectual openness and humility and gentleness to them that has infused the particular culture that they have helped seed. And so progress studies, even where I think it has its own variants, I mean, I do think there are sort of like left progress studies types and right progress studies types and so on. I think it just has a kind of openness to it that, that some of the others have turned really harsh, right? I think a lot of these things, take on the cultural and the temperamental attitudes of the people on top of them, right? So I was saying earlier, there are divisions in crypto. You can really see a difference between like the kind of Vitalik side of crypto and like the Balaji, Chris Dixon, et cetera, side of crypto, right? Those cultures, even on Twitter, begin to sound like the people on top of them. So I want to note that as a thing that I give Tyler and Patrick a lot of credit for. Where are my big disagreements with Patrick? I think I actually just don't know enough about what policies he would and wouldn't support to really say. I think we're probably more or less in some alignment these days about a bunch of bureaucratic questions. I would say I'm probably more uncertain than he is as to whether the scientific slowdown is truly technical. I probably put more credence on the view than he does, at least in our interview, that we just can't have a doubling or tripling, or I should say doubling, I think, because that's what we talked about of the speed of science. I mean, that's Will McCaskill's view, I think, that like a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. But yeah, I think I don't have a good answer to this in part because he kind of stays to a lane where he's very sure. And knowing Patrick, I think he's got a lot of opinions I disagree with, but he doesn't make them a huge part of his public persona.
Makes sense. In a recent podcast, you talked about, it was kind of a year 2022 wrap up. You talked about how equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are kind of closer than people are comfortable with in some ways. That if you have grand differences in outcomes, it's harder to have equal or closer to equal opportunities. And I appreciate you saying that because I feel like it's more intellectually honest to connect the two. Not that they're totally equal, but than people often do. And I'm curious, when people talk about the idea of like saying, so you could do that. Another path is also to focus on a kind of sufficient floor for everybody that is, dignified and real, but less worry about the differences, the inequality there. Why are you less excited about that path, if I was to guess?
If you were to guess why I'm less excited about that path?
Yeah, or if I was to guess that you're less excited about it.
I think I have a very strong, like the why not both girl gif here answer. I do believe very strongly that you should have a base level of sufficiency. And I don't believe that true equality of opportunity is possible. Like that's that's the whole point of that long rant I went on.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that equality of outcome is desirable. Now, I think more equal opportunity is possible, dramatically more than we currently have. And I think more basic sufficiency is possible. And I also think more betterment is possible. I mean, one reason I focus so much now on questions of innovation is I think that it's really important not to get stuck in a kind of political straitjacket of imagining that all we're trying to do is redistribute the status quo along slightly more just lines. Like you want to quite dramatically change the status quo. I did a piece, must have been, I don't know when this will come out. So a couple months ago when this comes out, about energy abundance and, all the possibilities that could be unlocked by having a truly energy abundant future. the idea that we just want sort of what we have now rejiggered is, I think, a sort of poverty of imagination. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't run around trying to choose between them. I think all of them. I think they all connect to each other too. You're going to have more sufficiency and a more opportunity equalizing world, and like that will lead to better. It's complicated. It's interconnected.
Totally, but let me ask a different variation of it. Is the inequality of it important to focus on because inequality breeds resentment? Like, assuming you were lifting everyone, significantly, but the top was lifted more, is the inequality worth focusing on because it breeds resentment?
I don't think that would be my first reason for focusing on inequality. I think my first reason for focusing on inequality, which I don't think is something I primarily do focus on, is that I typically am worried about, I don't think in practice you get the world you're talking about. So I think that you end up getting huge gaps in political power, which ends up creating certain kinds of political outcomes. I think you end up with huge gaps in voice, which end up creating certain kinds of political outcomes. I think that, but I would be in general be less worried about a world significantly where you had more inequality, but much more rapid growth and sufficiency than than in the world we're actually in. So, I wrote a piece. This is, God, back in my Washington Post days, but I proposed a sort of like distinction between a world where you had sort of a twice as high, I think the way I put it was like a twice as high or 3 times as high median wage, but more inequality versus like the median wage we have and like half as much inequality, and like which world would you prefer? And like I would prefer the world with twice as high or 3 times as high median wage. I mean, assuming we're adjusting for inflation and all that good stuff, with more inequality. At the same time, it's not a very real choice. And I worry about, I was talking, I did a fun podcast with Sam Altman a while back, and we were talking about like, should the first trillionaire be is that something to celebrate? And I said no then, and I would say no now. And I think you look at, Elon Musk has come up a bunch in this conversation, and you see why I'm worried. I don't think it is a good idea, putting everything else you think aside. And I've typically been, I'm less so now because he like relentlessly, is like making himself a political figure. But I've said for a very long time, up to and including when he bought Twitter, like, look, this is a guy who makes green energy technologies, has made electric cars cool, makes rockets, and is maybe being able to code these things as culturally conservative. Like, you can do a lot wrong, and that's still actually a pretty big contribution. I still don't think, even if he did less from my perspective, that was a problem, that the richest man in the world should just buy one of the most important communication platforms in the world. Like, that should be okay with anybody. You don't want this kind of concentration of power. And so I just think this stuff is not to be taken lightly. And the idea that it won't happen, right? We'll get a trillionaire, but they'll just focus on their knitting. I mean, we're seeing that that's not true. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. That happened when I was there. Like, Elon Musk owns Twitter. I don't, what's his name? Benioff owns Time. And, we can have debates about the relative merits of these owners, but concentrations of political power and speech power and communications power and financial power all in the same person, I just don't think there's any way you can look at like all of human history and not worry about that.
Yeah, it is fascinating. There's kind of this meta debate related to labor and capital of like who actually has power. Like, Bezos owns the Washington Post, but does he really determine what's on the Washington Post? Sometimes they're criticizing Amazon. It is, and both sides kind of saying, refusing to kind of acknowledge their own power is kind of ironic.
But with Bezos, that's a choice, right? Look, I don't know exactly how that deal is structured, but he could have done, I think, what Musk did. Right, which he could have come in and fired everybody he didn't like and remade it along his image. He didn't, and I think that's to his credit. But I also think the Washington Post could probably only go so hard on Amazon, even under its current guise. Right, it can do some critical of Amazon reporting, but if it became a big anti-Amazon outlet, I think that would be a problem for him. Rupert Murdoch has bought institutions, remade them much more along his lines. We're watching Musk do that at Twitter. You don't want to rely on the neutrality or gentility of billionaires
Yeah.
or hypothetically of trillionaires as your sole check on
Yeah.
their behavior or the informational commons. I think that's just a naive position. The fact that Bezos seems to have bought the Post as a kind of legacy project and semi favor to his friend Don Graham, and Musk bought Twitter because like he felt that Twitter had become too woke. The difference is not anything outside of what their intentions were. And I just think that is not how we should accord.
Yeah.
That's just not how this whole thing should work.
It is fascinating. Yeah, Elon's career arc or political arc in the last year has changed drastically, and it didn't seem inevitable. It hasn't happened to lots of other billionaires, and so it is a question as to will that encourage others, or is this really just like a one-off? And it doesn't even seem deeply ideological. To your point, it seems more reactionary to the challenges he was facing uniquely.
Yeah, I don't look. I'm not in his head, and I think that this particular journey he's been on is one a number of people have been on for different reasons. And look, you do have more liberal billionaires. I think that there is a kind of unrestrained nature to him,
Yeah,
where other people would not apply their own preferences quite so baldly. Like he's willing to take a level of public backlash. A lot of people in this
right.
position wouldn't be, right? Willing
Yeah,
to gamble on Tesla in a way others wouldn't, right? I've met him a couple times. And there is a all-inness to him
yeah,
that is distinctive. And look, one thing you learn, I think, as you just become a more mature person and get older, is that for everybody, the good of them is the bad of them. Like
yeah,
if you look at any person you want to choose, like particularly people like highly on the public stage or have been very successful, it is exactly what makes them successful that makes them a problem in their own personal lives or in their professional lives or whatever. And that's true for him. It's true for everyone. So yeah, there's a lack of restraint to him that allows him to make gigantic bets and like fully commit himself to completely weird pathways. And some of them really pay off in ways I like, and some of them are not things I like. Um, Most people aren't like that, but I do think something that for whatever reason in this era, we're seeing that pay off more for more people. I think it is a personality type, particularly that is somewhat rewarded on social media. Like if you are this kind of person, a Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and there are others like them who can sort of operate at that level, at that scale, without a lot of the sense of social restraint
yeah,
that pulls a lot of people back. Like, I just don't want all this incoming for good and for ill. Like, this is a pretty good era for you. I mean, maybe it's totally devastating on you personally. Like, I don't know how it feels to them on the inside, but I sometimes joke that this is really the era of the trickster god. That
yeah,
the kind of personality type mythically that is doing well right now, like at the very, very high levels, is a trickster god. And then on the other side, like true restraint, right? So we don't talk about them as much, but it's been a very good couple of years for Joe Biden, for Tim
yeah,
Cook, for Jeff Bezos. Frankly, I think Mark Zuckerberg is profiting off the Elon thing quite well. All of a sudden, it's like, maybe not that bad.
yeah,
So you have this thing where it's like you have like the highly restrained figures and their opposites. And those are the two like big personality types right now. But of course, the highly restrained figures, like they don't say that much that we talk about all the time. But I
yeah,
do think the fact that, temperamentally, Joe Biden is such a strategic, like kind of finger in the wind player is not an accident after Trump, right? There is
yeah,
something about this moment where you have either the people like all in on the attentional economy or almost all out on it. But it's very
yeah,
hard to be half in. Like that's one reason I'm not really on Twitter or almost in any of these places anymore. I'm like too much a half in person in that way.
yeah.
And I prefer to be in things where I'm all in, right? Like podcasting. And so I don't know. This is a little bit of like a weird side quest from me, but I do think there's something to that, and I think that it's not just him, right? I think that there are
Yeah.
politicians on the left and right, and VCs and everybody else. Like it's a dynamic of the platforms.
I agree with that a lot. The good of the person is also the bad of them, and the all in versus not. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good note to wrap on as well. You typically end your great podcast where you ask your guests for book recommendations. I'll ask you just for one for a predominantly tech or Silicon Valley audience. What's either a book or something that they should read in addition to Wow, We're Polarized, of course, that you think might give them some perspective outside of their usual perspective.
I think they should read Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
Yeah.
I think that for most of the people we're talking about, the most important thing, like tradition to begin to unearth, is like what I would call like the mid-century media theorists, and they're writing in the time of television.
Yeah.
But they understood something that I think we've really lost about, I mean, the cliche of this, of course, is a medium is a message, but nobody really understands what that means. They understood that how mediums change us and make us plastic in their hands is much more important than what we do on them. And more, that we almost always miss that effect, that we always feel like we are the ones acting upon the medium. And it is almost always, at least as potently, the medium acting upon us and changing us. It's a huge disagreement I have with a lot of the people we've talked about in this show. If you want to read a more modern version of it, you could read The Shallows by Nick Carr, which is a good book too, and comes a little bit closer to this era. But I think it's really worth going back to Postman, who, is kind of popularizing and moralizing Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan's great to read. You should read Understanding Media. I recognize these are a bunch of references, but it's worth reading Understanding Media, but it is hard to read, whereas Postman is a pleasure. So read Neil Postman, read Amusing Ourselves to Death, maybe Technopoly, I think it's called, but that's where I would begin.
Yeah, it was just your point on the platforms. It's funny. I mean, people started on Twitter talking about what they're eating for breakfast, and afterwards they get what we call Twitter brain and start getting in all these fights. Ezra, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great episode.
Thank you for having me.
Secureframe is the leading all-in-one platform for security and privacy compliance. Get SOC 2 audit ready in weeks, not months. I believe in Secureframe so much that I invested in it, and I recommend it to all my portfolio companies. Sign up for a free demo and mention Upstream during your demo to get 20% off your first year. Now, more than ever, startup founders need a safe place to put their cash. Mercury protects your money and also provides the streamlined user experience that great founders expect. Through partner banks and their sweep networks, Mercury offers up to $5 million in FDIC insurance, which is 20 times the per bank limit. They also make it easy to invest any cash above the FDIC insured amount in a money market fund. 100,000 startups trust Mercury with their finances. I've been a happy Mercury customer and have found their team incredibly helpful and responsive. They even got an important wire out of purgatory on Christmas Eve. After all, your Christmas is my opportunity. Visit Mercury.com to get started. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC. MarketerHire is one of my favorite resources for startups looking to hire marketers. With thousands of pre-vetted marketers across a dozen roles, MarketerHire matches you to your perfect marketer in 48 hours. Whether you need help with growth marketing, SEO, lifecycle, content, or any other aspect of your marketing strategy, MarketerHire has you covered. So if you're a founder looking for top-notch marketing talent to help grow your startup, head over to MarketerHire.com to find your perfect match. Sign up with referral code UPSTREAM and you'll get $1,000 credit on your first hire.